Hello everyone, Namaste. I am Ramnath who would like to share with you some information on the VLSI topic. Can STA setup plus hold be negative in a sequential element? Please feel free to provide your comments or any suggestions. Thank you. Before we figure out whether setup plus hold value will be negative or 0 or positive, we will individually figure out what is the amount of setup in a sequential element and what is the amount of hold. Then we will figure out their sum. Okay, so first we will figure out what is the setup value. We are considering here the D flip-flop, and for ease of understanding, we will figure out what will be the setup for the positive edge triggered flip-flop. This whole discussion is applicable for any other flip-flop, for any other even for the negative edge triggered flip-flop as well. As mentioned earlier, we will figure out the setup time and then the hold time for the D flip-flop for the positive edge triggered, so that it will be easy to understand. So in the case of setup time, before we go further to analyze, this is the D flip-flop representation in transmission gate. The borderline will signify this boxed line. So this is the D, same as here. This is the clock here, and the Q, this one. So this is the internal circuit. What I would like to also mention is these inverters will be part of the D flip-flop. These are not outside the clock. Clock tree will have the clock buffers that will be part of the entire top level design, and that will be separate. Usually you will see them, but these are all part of the inside of the D flip-flop. So this is the transmission gate, another transmission gate. They are positioned in such a manner that they will ensure the proper operation of the D flip-flop. So in the when clock is triggered at different frequencies as per the need, then it will go sometime for high and sometime for the low. So this operation repeats in a regular manner. So when the clock is low, you will observe that the D value has not yet reached Q. So D does not completely reach Q. Okay, this is when the master latch will be operated. Okay, here if you observe, this TG3 is off. Okay, TG3 is off and TG1 is only on, and TG2 is also off. TG4 is off on. So because of this slave latch will retain the previous data. Okay, so whatever data is here, what this flip-flop sees, that will not be seen here. This slave latch will be retaining the previous data, and for all further analysis, slave latch will not be especially for this setup analysis, slave latch will not be useful because this TG3 will be completely blocking it. So we will not be considering for the setup analysis. So what is happening is, like, now when clock is low, TG1 is on, TG2 is off. So the data will be moving from here all the way through this inverter and through this inverter, and will stop here. Okay, so and when the clock is high, here when the clock is high, the transmission gates, once they are stable, then the TG1 is off, TG2 is on, TG3 transmission gate 3 is on, TG4 is off. So now the data here, whatever was there here, it will be able to move through this and reach Q. So slave latch will come into play in the hold, and master latch logic will be slowly getting cut off from the external data. That means the D data. And once the data is cut off, then this D port can change at will. So, and whatever change will not be seen within the internals of the flip-flop. Okay, so whatever was captured earlier will be retained by master latch and it will be sent to the output. So that is why it is able to store this element. That is why this is acting like a memory element and it is going here. So now we will analyze the setup time. So bringing back again, clock is low, okay, and the same as mentioned earlier, TG1 is on, TG2 is off, TG3 off. So I'm just simply cutting off the slave latch part. So for the current situation, if you observe, the data has to be stable before the clock edge becomes 1. Okay, so that is what is set up, we already know. So, and before this it can be changing. So after this hold has been ensured, even after that also data can be changing. We will further see what will happen when the duration, why we need to keep that much setup time. So if you observe, setup time of the flip-flop equal to time delay it takes for the data to come from here, crossing this inverter, and then coming all the way up to this. It cannot cross this data because this TG2 is off during the when the clock is low. Okay, and there is some time needed for the data to move all through and up to this point. And we also need to remember that when this will all happen during this time. Okay, when clock is low, that's what is mentioned here. Okay, but when it becomes 1, that means like you can figure out, you can think that this transmission gate 2 will start becoming 1 and then this data will be moved out. Okay, for now we will think that this is that is why I was mentioning that even the positive clock high data will be useful. We will just study a bit. So now, considering the delay from the clock port, so clock has to come and then go up to this one. That means like it has to generate clock dash and clock dash will be used here and clock will be used here. Similarly, clock will be used here, clock dash will be used here. So that way it will be slowly making the transmission gates go into different mode of operation. That means like earlier it was on, slowly it will be turning it into off in the clock equal to high. Okay, so these two items will affect the setup. So setup of the flip-flop depends upon TD4. That means like delay it takes from data to come data port to all the way up to node 4, and also it depends upon the T clock data. That means like how long it takes the data from signal from clock to reach all the way up to clock. So thus creating clock bar and clock signals. So setup time is depending upon this equation. So if you observe, based on TD4 and TCKD, setup time can be positive or negative. Sometimes it can be 0 also. Yeah, to figure out the hold of the D flip-flop, we will consider what will happen when clock equal to high. When clock is high, as we discussed earlier, D value is not blocked, but it will go from the main port, the data which was there here, it will reach the Q port. Okay, here it is not blocked actually, and then say during that time this transmission gate will be off and the transmission gate 3 will be on and transmission gate 4 will be off, 2 will be on. So data will be retained within the master latch and it will be sent out to the Q port. So here this is what it means, like when the clock has been triggered, so the amount of time required. Okay, so we will see what all the items which contribute to this hold time. Okay, so if you observe carefully, hold time of the flip-flop depends upon the time taken for the transmission gates to respond fully from its earlier state. That means, like earlier when clock was low, okay, then what was the situation of the transmission gate, and when clock goes high, the new transmission gate situation state. Okay, how long that time it takes for them to respond fully. Okay, so earlier this transmission gate was off when clock was low, and how long it will take for this time to respond and it will become off. So that is represented by the TTR. So if you observe carefully, you will see that they are changing states and then becoming off, and some of them becoming on. Okay, so that duration the hold depends upon. And aside to that, you will also observe that the data whatever is there here, it has to reach up to this point. So this time is also crucial. Okay, it will also affect the hold time of the flip-flop. So assume that the reason why this time is important is, once they say earlier this master was holding one value, more like a memory element, and that is basically given out to the clock port, Q port. So assume that the data here has changed and got through this. Once it enters this one, this was retaining the previous data, and if the new data goes through it, then it will corrupt this whole system, and then the queue will go into an indeterminate state. So that is what we wanted to avoid. So the time taken for the signal to cross from D port to up to this point also a concern for this hold time. So that is why this need to be subtracted, and the new hold time will be TTR minus TD0. That means like time taken for D to come to 0 node. Aside to that, as discussed earlier, how long it will take for the clock signal to come and generate this clock and clock bar signals. So on these two items and the third item, the hold time depends upon. Okay, so hold time based on these values, TTR and CKD and TD0, the hold time can be positive or negative or 0. Yeah, as discussed in the earlier slides, we have figured out the setup and hold individually, and we will now discuss whether setup and hold plus hold can be negative. Okay, so as discussed, like what is the setup value we have for a flip-flop we have calculated, and that depends upon these two items. Okay, from here all the way up to this, and the clock T. Now how long it takes from this to come to and generate clock and clock bar signals. Okay, so aside to that, we have also figured out what will be the hold time. So based on this, we have this is the equation we have arrived at. So based on these two items, we will see on what items setup plus hold will depend. So you will observe that adding this one and this item, you will figure out that setup plus hold depends upon T0 to 4. That means like node 4 to node 0 to node 4 delay, and TTR transmission gate response. That means like from off state to on, in some cases on state to off. Okay, so node 0 all the way up to 4. That means like from here up to this point. That is what is represented here. Exploring further the setup plus hold value, we will, as we discussed earlier, setup plus hold of a flip-flop depends upon these items for the setup, and for hold these items. Okay, so based on these delays, the setup plus hold are dependent. So you will observe that t plus setup plus hold is t node 0 to 4 time duration and trigger for the transition time for the transmission gate to respond. So definitely these two values cannot be zero. So that is why in any discussions we will be using this fact that setup plus hold cannot be zero. It must always be more than zero. This is the basis of that. And if you observe that in certain situations, setup time can be positive and hold time can also be positive, thus leading to this equation again. So here, but before this point, data can be changing. Even after the hold time, data can be changing. It is not necessarily that it has to be retain the same value. So this is one condition. And another situation wherein setup can be negative. That means like clock is here, same as here, but data is changing even after the clock triggering edge. Note, that means like as in this situation, this is setup. So TD4 minus TCKD. So here TD4 is not greater than TCKD. So that is why you are finding that setup is time is negative. So data is changing after the clock triggering edge. Okay, so you have to go back to the earlier circuit and see why TCKD is larger. That means like the buffer, the inverters in the clock chain will take more time than the time it takes for the signal from data port to all the way up to node 4. That is why the setup time is becoming negative, represented here. And if you observe the hold time, which is from this stable last point all the way up to clock, this is the hold time. This is greater than the setup time. That is why setup plus hold is positive again. Not only in this case where setup and hold are individually positive, even if when setup is negative, hold time will be greater than the setup time and ensuring that setup plus hold is positive. Okay, in another situation wherein you can definitely ask what will happen if hold time is negative. Same thing, you will observe that this is the clock triggering edge and data is changing before the clock triggering edge. Okay, this is the hold time. This one is negative. Okay, so this is negative and still the flip-flop is functional when setup time is more than the hold time. That is what is this mode. So here this is the last stable point, first stable point all the way up to clock triggering edge. So this is the setup time. This is much more than the hold, negative hold value. So that is why even in this case also setup plus hold is positive. In the soft design implementation, we keep hearing that the setup and hold values have to be maintained. So we will see here now why we are so stringent and strict about that rule. Okay, where for simplicity, for ease of understanding, we will consider the setup time, why it has to be maintained, and the discussion can be extended even to hold analysis. Okay, before we analyze into setup, we will figure out first what are the assumptions involved in this. For simplicity, we will again assume that hold is 0 and the clock delay, this delay is 0. Okay, and we also assume that transmission gates, these will react instantaneously. That means as soon as the data comes from the clock, they will be moving from the previous state to the new state. That means either off to on. And we will also figure out, we'll also consider that inverter delay is 3 nanosecond, and we will assume that the setup required time is 9 nanoseconds. That means like the duration for the 3 nanosecond, another 3, another 3. So whatever it comes and all the way up to this one, because we have removed the clock delay part in the from the setup time. So now if you observe the figure out the what will be the D2 clock setup, whether this is valid. Okay, so in this time units we will see that this is the D time, and it is stable till 9 nanosecond, and then it is changing the state from low to high. Okay, so this is the D port, and this is the clock. That means like if you compare with this rising edge, this D is changing 9 nanoseconds before. That means like it is remaining stable for 9 nanosecond before this. Okay, so that is when afterwards it is changing. So this is good. So now we will see what are the internal nodes. This is node 0. Since it acts, transmission gate acts instantaneously. Now in this situation it is completely stable and on. So now this is allowing it to move. So and this duration is 0. So whatever is there in node 0, it will appear on node 1. And how long it will take? This will take 3 nanosecond. Okay, the next 3 nanosecond the data will move from node 1 to node 2. So this data, whatever was there 0, it will become go to node 0 and then node 1 after 3 nanosecond. Now this is an inverter, so the value logic level changes. So now after 3 nanoseconds, now it becomes 1, and it is remaining stable for 9 nanosecond. So same thing, it is remaining stable till 9 nanosecond, and 2 and 3 they are same, so they are changing after 3 more nanoseconds. So now they are changing to inversion of this one, so this is changing and then keeping it stable till 9 nanosecond. And here now 4 is again an inverter of node 3. So you will observe that after 9 nanoseconds the data here will reach this point, and then it will again change the state. So now if you observe, now assume that now the clock works, and then this transmission gate is on. We will see what will happen as soon as this is on. Since these are all instantaneous and the transmission gate responds instantaneously, the data here and this one, they will see each other. What was the data which was at node 1 at this time 9 nanoseconds? That is this one high, and this one is also high. Okay, the node at 4, that is also high. That means like even if you take this one, this is also high. That means like whatever this data here and data here, they are same logic level. Okay, so there is no contention. That means like once the logic clock turns on, trigger edge, and then assume that hold is 0, then the data here, where since the transmission gate changes, and then your data will signal will reach the Q port. So this is working properly as expected. So when the setup time between D and clock is 9 nanosecond, the data what was stable for 9 nanosecond is able to reach the Q port. Now we will understand, we'll figure out what will happen if the setup time is not ensured. Okay, so that is what is explained here. Between 9 to 12 the data is stable, and hence the transmission gate is on. When the transmission gate is on, as clock trigger edge is high, the data will go from data port to the Q port. Now we will figure out what will happen, assume after 30 nanoseconds. Okay, so now the data is stable and then changing now, and it is becoming it is changing the state at after 6 nanoseconds. That means like it was 0, it is remaining 0 till 6 nanosecond. What we wanted for this clock to reach proper, to take the signal properly, For this flip-flop operation, we were mentioning that setup has to be 9 nanoseconds, but it is stable only for 6 nanoseconds. Then what will happen here? 1 is changing after 3 nanoseconds, 2 and 3 are changing after 3 more nanoseconds, and assume that the fourth, that it will change after 9 nanoseconds. Now you observe here, when assume clock comes instantaneously and goes high here, then this transmission gate will go from off to on, and now these two data, node 4 was having positive high logic high, and the node 1 is having logic low. If you observe that these two are contentious, opposing each other at this point, because the setup time was not maintained. Because of this, clock will, once it transmission gate opens, the data gets collided, corrupted, and hence the queue goes into indeterminate state. That is what we wanted to avoid. Hence we will say, for this flip-flop, D has to be maintained the required time units, so that the clock, when it is allowing the transmission gates, then the whole data will move smoothly to the queue without any issue, without any data corruption. Here are the some references I have used. This YouTube is also very good. Please feel free to watch this one. This is about setup and hold. I have also taken one more small data from the VLSI expert as before. So feel free to go through these documents also. It will give some good information.